As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster.
When I get in a tight spot, I shoot my way out of it. Why, sure. You know, this game ain't for guys that's soft.
When Dutch comes around, he's gonna leave you some beer, and you're gonna take it, and you're gonna kick him with the dough.
Well, let that muck make a muck out of me, but don't anybody try it again. Just keep in mind that I and the boys is candidates for hanging.
The thing that the criminal presents, they're fascinating characters for normal, healthy people to watch because they're seeing life outsized. It's life blown up, characters blown up to 20 feet. And you're comparing how you would never do that, but you're fascinated by somebody who did.
Okay, pal.
It's always suggested in a way that the gangster is the sort of the tragic American hero or the tragic American villain. I mean, he's somebody that appeals to audiences because he's bad, but and because audiences really, in a way, would like to be like the gangster, but they don't have the courage.
Shoot enough.
It's like the American dream come true. They get money, they get power, they get women.
Don't worry, honey. You still have me.
You know, who doesn't want to be feared by everyone and eat whatever you want and sleep with whoever you want, stay out all night with your friends gambling and come home whenever you want and have all this money.
The gangster film is the urban extension of the Western, in which you generally follow the wrong guy. And the wrong guy is mesmerizing.
People saw a genuine American art form developing in the 30s, and they didn't quite know what to make of it. An art form where, as Raymond Chandler said, the streets are dark with something more than night.
From the earliest days of the art form, the reality of crime offered exciting possibilities to motion picture pioneers. Audiences were riveted by an encounter with the unknown and mysterious. Crime was sensational, dramatic, and real, the perfect component for selling movies. One of the earliest examples of crime in cinema was the 1898 short entitled The Burglar on the Roof, produced by the Edison Company. This film and others like it were almost documentary in execution, simply presenting petty criminals and the police forces who attempted to apprehend them. As fictional drama began to dominate the medium, crime and violence offered the most powerful visual and narrative opportunities, especially in the form of the Western, filled with thieves, murderers, and bad men. It is no coincidence that the Great Train Robbery, made in 1903, was cinema's first narrative film. The Black Hand, shot in 1906, was the movie's first glimpse at what would later be identified as organized crime, showcasing the Italian underworld rooted in the bowels of New York City. The genre was quickly finding its way.
There wasn't really a conscious development of scripted crime dramas in the United States until, I think, 1912, when D.W. Griffith, then still at Biograph, came in with the still famous film Musketeers of Pig Alley, which may well be the first identifiable ancestor of the Warner Brothers gangster pictures.
It's really interesting because the locations are fantastically evocative. In the background, accidentally, are lots of things that are like a coloured-in version of those famous stills of tenement life in the Lower East Side. So you get that. But the story is pure Charles Dickens. It's like the Artful Dodger type gangs, you know, kids going around in a Dickensian way. So it kind of, you've got modern setting, Dickensian story. And I think the gangster film, pre the 1930s, has very much a whiff of that throughout.
Most people, I guess, sort of date the gangster feature from the 1915 film Regeneration, directed by Val Walsh. It is fascinating that here is Val Walsh sort of making what is perhaps, well, certainly the first feature film about gangsters. And years later at Warner Brothers in the 1930s, he's going to make some of the best gangster films with sound.
Raoul Walsh shot it in what was remaining of the old 5 Points in New York. And it's quite remarkable for its authenticity and for what it says about that lifestyle and the nature of poverty dictating how certain kinds of personalities are just going to give in and do it.
He actually used, for much of the cast, real gangsters, real prostitutes, and other disreputable characters. They're on hand.
Regeneration is basically the story of a society woman who does sort of social work in the slums of New York, and she falls in love with a gangster.
We have an orphan kid, and here he drifts very easily into this gang to get money and food and respect. So the paradigm of the gangster film is there in Raoul Walsh's film.
Films like Regeneration recounted tales of the petty criminal, ruffians, and small-time hoods, as this was the nature of crime during the early 20th century. But America changed during its experience in World War I. The moral climate shifted to reflect a society that spurred violence and vice, particularly the vice of drink. A movement arose within society that gave the gangster his greatest opportunity to climb out of the gutter and rise to power. This movement was called Prohibition. With pressure from religious and conservative groups, Congress passed the Volstead Act, thus banning the sale and consumption of alcohol throughout the country. The age of the gangster had begun.
Well, the Volstead Act was an unpopular amendment to the Constitution. And it was sort of like saying, if you want to drink Coca-Cola or milk, you've got to get it from the black market from now on. People just figured, okay, we're going to work around this. It's ridiculous.
No one in the country wanted that law. It was rammed through by a very tiny element. And so a world of speakeasies opened up. I mean, the state of Illinois during Prohibition had 46,000 speakeasies. You can't have 46,000 speakeasies without having the local congressman, the local state alderman, the local sheriffs, the police department, the fire department inspection unit. You can't have any of that without having those guys on your payroll.
And of course, the gangsters were having a wonderful time because they were the ones that were taking care of supplying the houses with the booze.
These guys, who had, until Prohibition, been nothing more than thugs. You'd walk down the street, they'd hit you in the head, they'd take your wallet. That's all they were. And they're the ones who began building up these bars and clubs and all sorts of stuff. And that's how it started.
Overnight, suddenly, something that almost everybody did became illegal. So in order to get a drink, you had to deal with a criminal. And that naturally led a lot of people to think that criminals weren't necessarily so bad.
And you're seeing on screen the bootleggers you knew, because that's how you got booze. And you were riveted to it because you had a direct personal connection. Everybody knew a bootlegger. I don't mean everybody. Anyone who wanted to have a drink, which turned out to be something like 85 to 89% of the American population.
Hey, Joe.
In the same way that the outlaws, Jesse James, Billy the Kid, whatever, even while they were alive, became celebrities and sort of Robin Hood type hero figures, no matter how appalling they were as people. The same thing kind of happened to gangsters in the 1920s with Prohibition, where you would have flamboyant figures like Bonnie and Clyde or Dillinger or Al Capone, who the newspapers just loved to tell stories about them.
The movie people pick up on the fact that those stories sold newspapers and thus could potentially sell movies as well.
Throughout the 20s, movies continued to showcase crime in the Bowery and the hoodlums that infested their streets. They relied on the environment as the feature attraction. While they were popular, they lacked the movie star presence to define the gangster, who he was and what he was about. Lon Chaney changed this. He relished in the seediness of the criminal and layered his villains with dark souls, cold hearts, and cunning viciousness. More than any other actor, he laid the groundwork for all that was to come.
Of all the silent picture actors, it was inevitable that Lon Chaney should somehow be drawn into the genre, if not on a regular basis, because he was, I think, by far the most versatile actor of the silent screen. And what he has particularly is the charm and magnetism that we associate with the Warner Brothers gangsters of the next decade.
The gangsters in the silent films usually were petty thieves. They weren't involved in organized crime, or they weren't big, powerful figures. This changed with a film called Underworld.
Underworld may fairly be said to have really to have kicked off the gangster genre in American film.
Underworld mostly takes place hidden away during the day, at night, in back rooms, in speakeasies, in illegal gambling halls, not places that most moviegoers see every day on their way to work.
The shootouts are all there. You've got the henchmen, you've got the rival gangs. All the elements are present.
So in that sense, the silent gangster films really set the tone stylistically, and also in terms of what the narrative context was going to be, what kind of characters you were going to see, and what kind of locations you were going to see them in.
Joseph von Sternberg's Underworld would be the last major effort of the silent era, released only months before Warner Brothers broke the sound barrier with The Jazz Singer. But it was a gangster film, The Lights of New York, that made full use of its soundtrack, hailing itself as Hollywood's first all-talking feature film in 1928.
Underworld was written by Ben Hecht. He won an Academy Award for screenwriting, the very first for Underworld. Great intertitles, but the gritty dialogue of the streets, you could not do that in a silent film, but you could get that with talk. And The Lights of New York had that.
What you mean, take him for a ride.
And you know, you're hearing the idiom of the gangster. You're hearing the slang. And they're being played by people who were on the stage in the theater and also people who lived in those neighborhoods.
You killed the cops, you know. We didn't have anything to do with it, did we? Shut up, will you? Will you pin those lips together and quit making those cracks about who bumped him off?
They were aware of all of this, so it wasn't something they had to go to school to learn.
And then, of course, the gangster has all of these sound effects, you know, machine guns, and skidding up tires on asphalt, police sirens. This is quite new.
There was a negative side to sound, and that was that back in the silent era, not just the gangster genre, but other films were shot on location. So you could really go to the areas where the gangsters hid out on the Lower East Side of Manhattan or wherever. With the coming of sound, the gangster film became studio-bound.
But all good things must come to an end, and the Roaring '20s came to a bitter crash. When Wall Street collapsed in October 1929, the American way of life was shaken to its core. Now everyone had to struggle for the bare essentials. Those who reveled in illegal booze now needed it to drown their sorrows. Gangsters offered not just the quick fix, but an example of how to fight a social system that no longer worked.
There's a famous essay by a wonderful writer called Robert Warshaw in, I think, 1948, called The Gangster as Tragic Hero, where he says, the gangster is the no to the great American yes. That's where the depression comes in, I think. That the great American yes is things are going to get better. The American dream, just over the next horizon, is another land to conquer. The great American no is a shadow version of that. Get rich quick, shoot your way to the top. It doesn't matter who you tread on the way up. So it's like a negative of the positive of the American dream, which is a very depression kind of concept.
I think there's always been a sense in the social fabric of American life that certain people have advantages that other people don't. And that's one of the elements that certainly plays itself out in the gangster films. Many immigrants came to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century because they felt that they would have better chance to make a good life for themselves here, that this was the land of opportunity. When they arrived here, what they found was a kind of entrenched power structure that in fact did throw a lot of impediments in their way to get ahead in their lives.
Immigrants are just convenient fall people for, all of our problems. Any strange people, quote unquote, are always going to be looked at a little askance. They're mysterious, they're swarthy, they're just easy marks to be not trusted. And so naturally they would be the bad guys.
It was very clear that these were people that were not part of mainstream America. We have to realize that until the Civil Rights Movement, people who were of a different ethnic heritage than, say, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants or Scotch-Irish, I suppose, were not considered white in the political sense. So these were the sons and daughters of immigrants. Warner Brothers owned theaters in the urban areas. They played to that audience who saw in themselves not gangsters. They saw someone who was trying to make it in an America that didn't fully embrace them.
You know, just as the Western in the silent era is a genre for rural immigrants, reminding them of why they came to the United States in the first place, the gangster film is the myth for the urban immigrant.
A gangster movie becomes something unique because these are larger-than-life characters. These are people that could control life and death. But I don't know a great gangster movie that isn't personal first.
I was about 10 years old, and Warner Brothers released, on a double bill, a reissue of Little Caesar and Public Enemy. My father took me to see them. And I think seeing these particular films on a big screen, the impact of them was very, very strong. And I think it stayed with me for many, many years. And there's no doubt that a response that some people in my neighborhood had to that type of picture. Much in the same way as, like, today people revere The Godfather as a wonderful film. And in that, there's always been this extraordinary feeling of empathy, in an odd way, with the outlaw, the gangster, even more so, in American society.
All of the iconic elements finally came together in a movie that would catapult the gangster straight to the top. Adapted from the popular novel by W.R. Burnett, Warner Brothers' Little Caesar captured the essence of Al Capone's popular rise to power. He took the form of a compact, homicidal egomaniac of the first order, named Caesar Enrico Bandello.
Out of town by tomorrow morning, you won't never leave it except in a pine box. I'm taking over this territory. From now on, it's mine.
Little Caesar is just one scene after another that will be influential in the development of the genre later on. Part of the reason that Little Caesar is still watchable today, even though it's an early sound movie and even though the direction is not perhaps fantastic, the style is pretty mundane and so forth, is that it just contains so many crucial elements and they're brought to life by this overpowering performance that Edward G. Robinson gives in that film.
Dancing. Women. Now, where do they get you? I don't want no dancing. I'm figuring on making other people dance.
Oh, I ain't forgetting all about the money.
Yeah, money's all right, but it ain't everything. Now, be somebody. Look hard at a bunch of guys and know that they'll do anything you tell them. Have your own way or nothing. Be somebody.
For me, just the very beginning of that film it sets a kind of model for the genre. The first thing we see is a gas station holdup. It's done in about 15 seconds of screen time. It's really quickly, but right away we're launched into this world of underworld activity. We understand right away what really motivates characters like Caesar Enrico Bandello. It's be somebody. It's get what you want from this life.
Screw, Mug.
You ain't giving me orders.
You're a fresh guy, huh? Take it easy, Rico.
I suppose it had a great deal of importance and a great deal of interest in its own day because of the Prohibition era. It was documentary. It was everyday occurrence that we had in those days. Mr. Capone was grabbing all the headlines.
People really knew that they were watching a picture about Al Capone. And Robinson's clear resemblance to the man certainly drew the customers and left nobody in any doubt as to who this picture was really about.
The audiences who saw Little Caesar thought, this man is a gangster, and this man is a hoodlum, and this man is not a handsome, sexy leading man like we're used to. But what does he have? He has some kind of riveting, strong, hungry personality that just reaches out of that screen and grabs the audience by the throat and says, look at me, and more than that, understand me.
You know, when I cast Eddie Robinson in Little Caesar, this big, tough gangster, or hoodlum as you call him, I want to get a big close-up way up to here. So I said, Eddie, all you have to do is shoot, but shoot fast and mean it when you shoot. So he took the gun, he shot like this, and he closed his eyes. I said, Eddie, you have to keep your eyes open. He says, I am keeping my eyes open. He says, watch. And he did the same thing again. He kept closing his eyes, this rough, tough hoodlum. So we took some tape, we bound his eyes open, tried to keep him open. We never could do it. It took me a day and a half to get him to keep his eyes open so that he didn't do this when he shot.
So I think that inner soul of a man who liked art, of a man who was not from the streets as George Raft might have been, was coming through in his characterizations and made them seem human. Not humanized them, not made us like them per se, but made us see a human being underneath that veneer.
Shoot, Rico. Get it over with.
Little Caesar was designed for entertainment. It was melodramatic. It was topical. And I think perhaps if it succeeded at all, and evidently it's had a great deal of longevity, I've often wondered why, it's because in the abstract, the construction of it was exactly that. It had a beginning, middle, and an end, and it's almost like a character in a Greek tragedy, one who defied the gods and society and is finally mowed down.
Little Caesar's more of a deco museum piece in a way, but in a good way, because Little Rico is a wonderful character, and Edward G. Robinson can do no wrong. But Public Enemy is the toughest in terms of its depiction of that world, the honesty, because it is a shocking film, it really is. And it still holds up, particularly if you see it on a big screen, holds up in terms of its ability to shock, but not shock in a gratuitous way. It's shocking about the truth of the world, the sordidness of the world that it's depicting.
Public Enemy derives most of its power from its star director, William Wellman, who layered his film with a harsh grittiness and immediacy that reflected a society gone wrong. Wellman injected a daring truth that could be seen on the streets of every broken city across America, that we all have potential to become public enemies.
William Wellman, The Public Enemy. Perfect match. Perfect. Look at the film today. The pacing of that. Compare that to an early talkie from 1930 that isn't a gangster film. It's like night and day. And how exciting that must have been to audiences.
I was met by two druggists in Chicago. And they were on the lot, and I was going to lunch, and they came up to me, and they introduced themselves to me. And they seemed like nice guys, and they said, look, we've got a story, and we want you to read it. It's called Beer and Blood. And they told me the neighborhood that their drugstore was in. So I said, come on, have lunch with me. So they did. So then I said, fine, I'll read it and let you know. And I went right back to the office, and I read it, and I went crazy about it. So I immediately went to Zanuck, and I said, look, I've got the best guy, not Beer and Blood. I told him the story. I got the script. It's wonderful. He said, look, Bill, I can't do another one. I just did Little Caesar and Doorway to Hell. We can't do it. Tell me why I should do it. I said, because I'll make it the toughest one of them all. He said, okay, you got it.
You murderers! There's not only beer in that keg. There's beer and blood. Blood of men.
You're talking about a man like William Wellman, who was in World War I, who was probably one of the most fearless men at that time, a real pioneer, and was known as Wild Bill, and was known as a ferocious fighter for what he believed in and the kind of films he wanted to make.
He had wonderful visual ideas, but story was first, so all of those great visuals were subservient to the story he was telling.
I found the score, the music score, very effective. And I didn't understand what it was for a while, but then I realized there's no music score. It's all source music.
Are you as happy as I am, Matt?
Sure, honey.
In a sense, the songs of the late teens and the early 20s and all the way through the early 30s, up to 1931 really, is the score. So in a way, the music comments on the society at the time also. It's part of, it really is almost like a documentary of the period.
In the case of Public Enemy, I think it's the basic and most important reason for its success was its attitude toward authority. Its almost gleeful thumbing of its nose at authority through the personality, the astonishing personality of Jimmy Cagney.
The thing that made it successful was one word, Cagney.
William Wellman's fierce direction was matched only by the charisma of his young star, James Cagney, a former Broadway song and dance man who was quickly making an impression in early talkies. As he was considered a supporting player, Warner Brothers cast him as the secondary lead in Public Enemy. But as soon as Wellman recognized Cagney's raw power, he wisely recast the picture, and another star was born.
Why, that dirty, no-good, yellow-bellied stool. I'm going to give her that putty nose right in the head the first time I see him.
Yeah, you and who else?
I think it might be easier for an audience to identify with Tom Powers than it could have with Edward G. Robinson's Little Caesar, because he really is sort of this product of the streets. And there's not the majestic aura about him that there is about Robinson's Little Caesar. He's more of this punk kid who's blossomed into this almost frightening, wolfish gangster character.
Oh, please, you ain't gonna slug me, are you?
Maybe not today. But I'm telling you this for the last time. When Dutch comes around, he's going to leave you some beer. And you're going to take it. And you're going to kick him with the dough. If you don't, somebody's going to drop by here and kick your teeth out one at a time. Get me?
The fact that James Cagney is a tough guy may be something to do with the audience wanting a representative who simply would fight, who would not accept what the world the way it was, and constantly coming at you. And that was a good thing to be in the 30s when so many people were squashed by impossible forces.
He, unlike Bogart, unlike Edward G. Robinson, he came from the streets, he came from the gutter. And Cagney never lost the gutter in his performance.
The fact that he was a dancer rendered his movements balletic, and if you actually watch him in action, he's an extremely elegant figure when he moves. He invents certain gestures, like a kind of friendly punch in the face to people. And if you see him even when he's interacting with other actors, there's a grace with which he does it, the elegance with which he does it is something to be seen.
I mean, are we supposed to like it when he puts a grapefruit in May Clark's face? I'm never sure. It's horribly misogynist. And I'm not quite sure where the heart of the film lies with that. It's really dreadful. What they hadn't perhaps calculated on was just how charismatic Cagney was.
Come on, they're bringing Tom home.
They are? When?
Right now, he's on his way.
The last scene of Cagney being trussed up, you know, and Donald Cook opens the thing. Warner said, "You got to cut it out." He said, "It made me sick. It'll make everybody sick." And Zanuck fought for it, and I fought for it, you know. But Zanuck was the one. No, Zanuck was a tough little guy. Don't kid yourself. And my fellow director was smoking a cigar, and Warner turned to him and said, "Mike, what don't you agree with me?" And Mike said, "Yes." Zanuck hauled off and knocked that cigar right down his throat. I'm not kidding you. Well, that's what made pictures that day. They don't do that anymore. And by God, it scared Warner, and we had no argument about it. That stayed in the picture. He hauled off and he let him have it. I said, "I can love this guy. I don't care what he does from now on." And that is a true story of Public Enemy.
The Public Enemy transformed the way gangsters looked, talked, and killed. As other filmmakers tried to surpass Wellman's effort, only one man had the guts to do it right. The young tycoon Howard Hughes had tackled the genre with his 1928 film The Racket. This time, however, he would not be outdone, pouring all of his money and passion into what became the most destructive and manic gangster film of them all, Scarface.
Scarface, really, it's not a Warner Brothers movie, but it has that Warner Brothers feel to it, because you have Paul Muni, who would become a Warner Brothers contract player in 1932. It also has Andy Dvorak, who was, one of the Warner stock company too. It also had George Raft, who would become a Warner Brothers player in the late 1930s. It was directed by Howard Hawks, who did some of his early films like The Dawn Patrol was one of his early Warner Brothers movies. So it had a lot of that Warner's talent involved in it. And I think because of that, it had a lot of that grittiness to it that was most associated with Warner Brothers. And it also wasn't unsparing in terms of the violence in that movie. If anything, I think it's even more graphic than in Public Enemy.
How that picture ever finally got released is one of the great mysteries, because it was going through all kinds of problems, because by then, both the Public Enemy and Little Caesar had been around, and there had been so many complaints and so many... Now, to even think about making Scarface. But Howard Hughes, he had the money, he had the drive, he had the wherewithal, was going to make this picture somehow, some way, and he did. And of course, it was going to be bigger, and more violent, and more this, and more that, and the other thing.
It's about violence, it's about guns. It's a little boy's world in a way. You see that particularly in Paul Muni. There's something so boyish about him. He just can't wait to get his hands on that Tommy gun. He suddenly sees this machine gun that can be carried in the middle of a St. Valentine's Day massacre, and he just doesn't even see all these bodies. All he sees is that gun that he can't wait to get.
Hey, that's swell. Look at little you can carry it. Come on, let's get out of here.
And toughness and seeming tough are the most important things.
And I get very, very upset, angry even, by the way the picture ends. One feels that they had to show the audience that after all this mayhem, the guy's really no good after all. And so when he is besieged by the police with his sister, he becomes quite manic. He loses control totally. And by the time he's facing the police, he's a sniveling, cringing coward.
Now give me a break, wait. You got me covered. See, I can't do this. Give me a break, wait. I told you you'd show up this way. Get you in a jam without a gun, and you squeal like a yellow rat.
And it's not at all in keeping with the rest of the picture. And I feel it's rather a shame that they presumably had to make that concession to contemporary sensibilities.
With Howard Hughes, he had no respect for the Hollywood establishment, and he had a very vocal contempt for the censorship, for the Studio Relations Committee.
Well, of course, he ran into nothing but problems with all not only industry censors, the motion picture industry censors, but also state and city censors. And in fact, they refused to release it in New York. They refused to release it in Chicago. Of course, it was about Chicago gangsters. So here, he kept revising it. They shot 3 different endings, and it was mandatory that he change the title from Scarface. He said, I can't change the title. That's what we're selling. They wanted to call it The Shame of a Nation, among other things. So the way it was released in many quarters was Scarface, The Shame of a Nation.
They really beat the hell out of him, and the film was released in several different versions, and it went through all kinds of problems, and it led to Howard Hughes leaving Hollywood for almost 9 years. But Scarface is really the film that caused the clampdown. There were no gangster films as such made after that film. There's just, Will Hayes said there will be no more.
That time in American film, that absolutely golden age in American film, there were no rules, and people had to find order in chaos. And the great storytellers did it. Mervyn LeRoy, Howard Hawks, Wellman. They had to invent a form. That's an amazing thing to have done.
In 1931, there are 25 gangster films made. 1932, 40 gangster films. You ask yourself, well, why did it click? The electrifying force of the gangster on the audience had something to do with the Depression. Remember, the Depression, the country is flat. The country has just folded. There's no activity going on. And here you have a figure who is all activity. He moves this way, that way. He talks fast.
We ain't got any time to lose. Come on, Sam, get yourself a car and let's go.
Not me. Take Scabby.
Nah, Scabby's no good.
No, I'm no good.
Bet you can drive, Otero?
Sure.
All right, let's go. We do some black roadster.
He gets things done. The movement took America's breath away when everybody else was just at a standstill.
And these people found a way to get rich quick. You identify with the person who's gonna hit the big time. All right, so they hurt a few people on the way, but that's part of their life, isn't it?
Take this. And when you need me more, just say so. I'm making plenty.
I think the real secret of the gangster film was that all these actors had such remarkable charisma. If you had a weak actor playing a gangster, it would editorialize against the part, and everybody would just say, well, he's no good and he deserves what he gets. But these men had such remarkable screen presence, all of them. They helped audiences believe that it would be fun to be these characters, and at the same time, though, they understood that they couldn't glamorize the roles to the point that they made it unrealistic. They had to play up the tragedy. They had to show that these men were heading for a fall.
The portrayals in Public Enemy by James Cagney and of Edward G. Robinson in Little Caesar had a profound effect on these men as actors. They became stars immediately because the films were so successful. But it also had a partially negative effect on them because it trapped them into these roles on which they had to try to recreate Little Caesar or Tom Powers, depending on who the actor was, continually over and over again. And these men sort of bridled at that. They felt that they had to continually struggle until they could break from it, which Cagney was able to do somewhat and Robinson somewhat, but never, ever, ever completely their whole lives.
Warner signed Muni after the great success of Scarface, and Muni, whose work, again, doesn't age as effectively as Robinson's, he became the great, legitimate Mr. Muni. Edward G. Robinson, more often than he wanted, stayed mired in the gangster films.
People had an idea that I talked out of the corner of my mouth, that I packed a gat, and that I knocked off Humphrey Bogart every morning before breakfast.
Quit tapping telephone wires. Spend your time building up new rackets. So that when McLaren comes up for air, you find a dozen more
It was all right for a while. I didn't mind that, but it does get a little bit boring and tiring.
The studios believed that the audiences wanted to see them again and again in those parts.
They never bought Jim the kind of properties that he thought he was entitled to. He wanted them to go out and get hit Broadway plays or best-selling novels or even a classic novel. He wanted to be treated with that respect. And instead they would invent these hard-to-handle kind of movies, or Blonde Crazy or something, which are wonderful movies. But they did not satisfy Jim's aspirations.
I mean, if you see something like Cagney in the 50s in Love Me or Leave Me with Doris Day, he plays a gangster. He's back into the gangster again, and now he's a much older man. And he gives a wonderful performance in it, but you have to sense that, in a way, it's sort of a defeat for him because he's gone all this way. Won an Academy Award for Yankee Doodle Dandy, in which he played a George M. Cohan, not a gangster, and then gone back again in the 50s to something he had done in many ways in the 30s.
Everybody's got larceny in his heart. Everybody's looking for something for nothing. Honest men are scarcer than feathers on a frog.
Oh, I know, Bert, but I've never been mixed up in a racket before. As I said, there are two things I haven't any use for, and jail is both of them.
Along with the new look and sound of Cagney and Robinson, there was the female equivalent.
We're going to put things on a business basis. Danny, you're the front. Swell office, everything on the up and up. The boys will dig up business and look after collections. Does everyone understand?
I think probably Joan Blondell remains the best known of the Warner stock company. And Joan Blondell was urban. There was something ordinary or familiar about her. People could recognize her type. She was very accessible. She didn't at all seem like some glamorous, mysterious, silent movie queen. She was somebody you would see on the streets of any city in America. And she had a vernacular rhythm and snap and crackle in her speech. She was wonderful with wisecracks. And she seemed good-hearted and likable. And she fit into the milieu of the underworld. And that was crucial to the gangster films.
Now you scram before I wrap a chair around your neck. But it's 3 o'clock in the morning. Where do you want me to go? Listen, you cheap stenographer. Outside, Countess. As long as they have sidewalks, you've got a job.
You're sure one smart fellow. You sure tell him a big mouthful.
Yeah. If that cheap district attorney get too fresh, nick the barber, give him close shave.
It's clear that in a number of gangster films, certain ethnic groups are associated with criminality.
Warner Brothers, because it's using a number of different actors from a number of different ethnic communities, in a sense, as an equal opportunity representer of ethnic gangsters. So you get Italian gangsters, you get Irish gangsters. I mean, the Cagney characters are often presented as coming from an Irish community. Later on with films like Once Upon a Time in America, that you get a representation of the Jewish gangster. So it's more ethnic than religion that defines the gangster in the 1930s.
W.R. Burnett, who wrote so many of these things, from Little Caesar to Asphalt Jungle, he was, I think, frankly appalled to note that all of the leads in Little Caesar are non-Italians. He'd written a story about Italian gangsters, and not one Italian appeared in the film. And I think perhaps he felt that they were trying to suppress the ethnic aspect of the picture.
You look at those first great batch of Warner's gangster films, and there's enough slang in there to carry generations.
There's a couple of dicks looking for somebody. Here, take this and scram.
I bet there were kids all over the country talking like this, horrifying their parents. Yeah, in exactly the same way there are kids now talking like the rap songs they've heard and their parents overhearing them and saying, you can't use words like that.
It's nothing but a racing form, you smack off.
I think part of the sort of titillation of early gangster films is that you get these ritual scenes of things like Jimmy Cagney being fitted for his first tuxedo.
42 and a half. 42 and a half.
The rough, uncouth thug getting good clothes and actually designing their own houses and all this kind of stuff. It's a slightly more attainable fantasy world than that of the Astaire Rogers musicals, which also have, tuxedos and glorious Art Deco, interior deco. But, Fred Astaire didn't have to kill anybody to get there, we assume.
You've got the modern energy, the cars, the machine guns, the dancing girls, modernity, chrome, nightclubs, that's get rich quick. There's a whole iconography of that. The interesting thing that once you've made money, you get modern architecture. Modern design is associated with James Cagney when he makes it. Energy, energy, energy.
Hey, Stoop, that's got gears, that ain't no Ford.
The male protagonist in the movie always bonds more with another male cast member, more so than any of the women in the film. I mean, if you look at some of the relationships they have with, girlfriends or wives or mistresses, they're never very strong relationships. I mean, it's very rare that you have that. Whereas they tend to bond with the best friend. A good example is Public Enemy. I mean, James Cagney's character is so distraught when the Nails Nathan character is thrown off of a horse that he goes right to the stable after that and he shoots the horse.
One reason I think that women are relegated to marginal roles is that the gangsters themselves have a female side to them. There's a vulnerable side that is brought out either with the mothers. I mean, Cagney is a great one for mother-son relationships.
Certainly in the case of Little Caesar, I don't think women were the top, goal that he had in terms of achieving power. For him, it was really all about, being the boss, saying who could get whacked, who couldn't.
I don't care how many fancy skirts you got hanging onto you. That Jane of yours can go hang. It's her that's made a softy out of you.
You lay off, Olga Rico.
I ain't laying off her. I'm after her. One of us has got to lose and it ain't going to be me.
There was this fear that these movies were going to inspire crime and to influence criminals, which is why when The Public Enemy came out, there was a prologue in the form of a disclaimer saying, we are not glamorizing criminals, we are showing that crime really does not pay, and of course it doesn't.
You usually had some sort of epigraph at the beginning, sometimes even taken from scripture. So I suspect they were seen as a kind of sociological form of morality tale. And, in the early 30s, the key thing about those stories is they're about rise and fall. They're the old story of nemesis and hubris. The first half is making it, treading on everyone's face. The second half is downfall.
Audiences love letting the evil out, but their conscience says that evil's got to get squashed again by the end, and by the end it always does.
It happens to Cagney in Public Enemy and in the Roaring Twenties. It happens to Edward G. Robinson in Little Caesar.
Is this the end of Rico?
It happens to Humphrey Bogart in High Sierra. It happens to Cagney again in White Heat.
I don't know why it is. Was there something about the 1930s that wanted these, martyr figures, but dying in the streets seems to be the payment you have.
There's clearly vicarious pleasure, but there's also the pleasure of seeing the transgressor punished, seeing the transgressor brought down, and reminding people, sort of saying to people, accept your lot in life. If you don't, you're going to end up like this.
Gangsters were rather flattered by the fact there were movies made about them, and they wanted to be seen to be as tough as Cagney and Robinson.
It was a film that lured John Dillinger out of his hideout and led to his demise in 1934 in Chicago. So even the gangsters found it attractive and appealing to see themselves and their brotherhood depicted on the screen.
It was no coincidence that Warner Brothers was the studio that most understood the gangster, and in turn made the most and the best of the formula. By its very definition, the gangster film fit directly into the style of movie that Jack Warner was committed to making. Warner Brothers made entertainment for the masses. Their stories might not have had the elegance or sophistication of the other studios, but their streetwise sensibility spoke the language of the American people.
One of those types of movies is certainly the kind of contemporary story that is, in a sense, ripped from the headlines, to use the cliche. And they make lots of movies of those kinds. The gangster films fit perfectly into that kind of template.
It was really Darryl F. Zanuck's idea that Warner Brothers was going to take stories from the headlines of the day and make those into the topics for the movies. This is not to say that Warner Brothers didn't make other types of films. They made crime melodramas, they did musicals, they did other things, but that was their specialty. That was what interested Zanuck in particular, and that's what set that studio apart from, let's say, an MGM, which wasn't doing that sort of thing.
But I think also Jack Warner had a fascination with the gangster image.
They were, in a certain sense, similar spirits. They were tough guys in their own nature. They responded to tough guys in fictional forms. I think they liked each other. They had a kind of similar energy.
I don't think it's pushing to say that Jack Warner had the look of a gangster. He had a certain swagger of a gangster. He had the very polished veneer and the big flashy smile of a gangster. He had a gangster aura about him.
If you read Jack Warner's autobiography, he writes that as a sort of child, as a teenager, he was working in a store, and that Italian gangsters would come into the store, threaten him, would steal and rob. And he also writes almost movingly about a young Negro boy who tries to hold up the store and is actually shot by the police. So I think these, obviously, the fact that he includes these in his autobiography indicates that Warner was fascinated by the gangster.
Oh, Jack Warner was a joy as far as I was concerned. I just adored him. It was a lovely feeling to know there was a boss. It was like having probably the best-looking young daddy that anyone ever had.
Jack Warner and his producers might have chosen the stories they made and how they told them, but they relied on a stable of strong directors to bring those stories to the screen. These men not only understood their subject, but more importantly, they understood how to create the experience of a Warner Brothers picture.
It's hard to identify a personal style, not impossible, but difficult, when you talk about Lloyd Bacon and Ray Enright and Mervyn LeRoy and all these others who cranked out, and that's what they did, cranked out those bread and butter pictures for Warner Brothers. It was really a house style that they were hewing very close to, and their work was carefully inspected on a daily basis by Darryl Zanuck and to a degree by Jack Warner too. And if it wasn't to their liking, things would be reshot.
When you think of the Warner Brothers films, you think of the realism, the grittiness of the productions, the skillful scripts and the manner in which the actors and actresses speak their lines, and the fact also that they're very sort of taut productions. They're not long films. They can cover someone's whole life in 80 minutes, and that's all they need.
I think it was William K. Everson said that no films were ever as fast-paced as the Warner Brothers, hour-long gangster films of the early 30s. I don't think even Michael Bay movies, move along at quite that clip.
Critics have taken up particular directors like Howard Hawks, Mike Curtis, Roll Walsh in particular.
William Wellman stands out, I think, a bit from the crowd, as he proved in his subsequent career.
People like William Wellman and Raoul Walsh had lived 10 lives before they even entered the movies. They were rough and tumble. These men were real men's men with their good taste, life experience, and knowing visual storytelling. They were just perfect for gangster film, just perfect.
Sometimes it didn't turn out that, they thought they were really making great art. They just wanted to get this thing done with the budget and the schedule restrictions that they had.
You give Michael Curtiz a script, he makes a good film, he makes it on schedule and on budget. I think that's what is true of so many Warner Brothers directors. They know how to make films. Doesn't matter what the genre is.
It's not like today where, a director can spend months making a movie. Back then they only really had maybe about 23 days to put a movie together. And that was an A picture. A B picture, it might be, more like 2 weeks.
In making films then, it was overpowering teamwork between the director and Mr. Zanuck, Mr. Wallace, Mr. Warner, the cutter, the lighting guy, a cameraman. They were all in on the cutting of it and the scoring of it. Everybody got everybody else's juices going, It was a glorious time.
We all rooted for each other's work in a way that I never observed again in any studio.
Warner Brothers itself was like a newsroom. They had people on the set writing the scripts even as they were filming them, and it was the constant turnover. Actors would go to the bathroom and come back and start on a new film. It was crazy pace, and you see that, of course, in the frenetic pacing and the sort of razor-sharp cutting of the movies.
The dialogue is moving quickly, and I think what sound also brings is the need for people who can write effective dialogue. So the influx into Hollywood of not merely people from Broadway, people from literature, but I think very importantly, the influx of newspapermen. And what is the newspaperman? The newspaperman is someone who's very good at writing quickly, writing with concision, taking a complicated event and giving it an abbreviated, direct, punchy form.
This is the way it was. They hustled us smokes into the death house, and I muscled my way right down front where I can get a good shot of the whole works. Am I talking too fast? No, go ahead. All right.
Dialogue was at a premium, and Hollywood was willing to pay. Writers like Seton Miller, John Bright, Kubrick Glassman, Ben Markson, and John Wexley were both craftsmen and artists who reinvented the screenplay form with their understanding of well-defined character, clever dialogue, and taut construction.
The writers who wrote the early gangster films, I think, don't get enough credit. It was really the writers who came up with these stories. It was the writers who came up with the dialogue that was so important in the films during this time period that really kind of set the template for the genre itself.
They were reporters writing, they weren't necessarily playwrights writing. I mean, they became playwrights quickly enough. They didn't respond to the 3-act system. They responded to the stories they'd heard about Capone and Dillinger and people like that.
If there is one writer who stands out from all the rest, it's certainly Ben Hecht, a guy who cut his teeth on writing underworld stories for Chicago newspapers during the time when Al Capone was rising to power and so forth, and wrote Underworld and then wrote Scarface.
Ben Hecht and Charles McCarthy, you just look at them, they were writing this stuff in the Chicago newspapers for years. They had been covering every bootlegger, every gangster in Chicago. They knew them. You could go and have drinks with them. They actually were police reporters. They were out there running around with cops. They actually did that stuff. They understood 2 things. They understood story and they understood language and dialogue. It was never fake, it was never stiff, it was as natural as you can imagine. And audiences just responded to it immediately.
W.R. Burnett is somebody known more as a novelist, actually, than a screenwriter, but his novel For Little Caesar, I think, was one of the crucial kind of building blocks in the history of the genre itself, and he will then contribute more as a screenwriter and novelist, High Sierra, and so forth later on. So writers were really, really important to the genre and haven't gotten as much attention, I think, as they deserve.
The person who took the credit most was the producer, you know, and he gave it to the director, and the director shot what was on the page. I wish I could give you a name of a whole bunch of list of people, which is a shame because they are deliberately made not to be known, even today.
But there were only so many ways Hollywood could retell the story of Rico Bandello or Tom Powers. Movie makers had to find clever ways to vary the formula while the gangster was still hot. One way was to give audiences two gangsters for the price of one. And that is exactly what Warner Brothers did with 1931's Smart Money.
The film was successful. It was successful. It was actually even nominated for an Oscar for Best Screenplay, I believe. And one of the reasons for that is it's a tremendously funny film.
It was made off the success of Little Caesar, but not off the success of Public Enemy because it was being shot simultaneously with Public Enemy. So consequently in the film, Robinson is definitely the star, the center of every scene, while Cagney's only brought in periodically as his friend and his cohort.
But it has a basic flaw in it as far as teaming these two guys. And that is one or the other of them, because of the very specific persona they have, had to be subdued.
Well, now look here, you youngsters. Where'd you keep that barber shop going?
Sorry to see you go, Nick.
Oh, well, boy, as soon as I make my killing, I'll send for you, and that won't be long. Here's your rent,
I'll be waiting.
Well.
And as a result, we have the Robinson gangster dominating. And you have the Cagney gangster almost feeling like restrained all the time. And as good as Cagney is in it, you have a situation where almost anybody else could have played that part. And so they really didn't belong together. One or the other was going to be diminished by appearing together. So it was the first and only time that Warner Brothers teamed the two of them, wisely.
Now, another variation of the gangster was the gangster as a director of a Broadway show in the Busby Berkeley Backstagers. You take a look at Warner Baxter in 42nd Street. You take a look at James Cagney in Footlight Parade. He's doing the same thing in Footlight Parade as he does in the gangster films.
Get out of here and stay out.
Yeah, we'll see about
Get out of here.
He is in charge, and he has something to get done, and he's going to do it.
Listen, get back to work. That whole third prologue has changed, and all the dance routines are shifted. Only this time it's going to be good. I'll be down with you in a minute. Go ahead, get to work.
And he doesn't give a damn about other people. And he mistreats other people, especially the chorus girls. They are little dictators, just like Little Caesar, just like Tom Powers in Public Enemy. It's the same thing.
I find it very telling that within just 2 years of Little Caesar and the Public Enemy coming along, making such an enormous impact, creating huge stars out of the previously unknown Jimmy Cagney and Edward G. Robinson, those two actors were already parodying their own personas in Warner Brothers films. In Picture Snatcher and in Lady Killer, Jimmy Cagney's essentially making fun of the kind of guy he played for real in the Public Enemy.
Now, open your mouth and close your eyes.
In Little Giant, Edward G. Robinson is absolutely spoofing a nouveau riche gangster who is trying to show off his newfound class and position in life.
You know, they're very distingué.
Very what?
Distingué means distinguished in French.
Oh, of course. How stupid of me.
By the end of the 30s, the original cycle, the energy of that cycle was all pretty much depleted. Plot-wise, it's an extremely limited genre, and it probably had the shortest lifespan of any other genre in Hollywood history. So it had to go into other areas. You know, it had to migrate into crime films of a more general nature rather than crime films specifically about the gangster.
Success of gangster movies caused controversy as early as the late 20s. State censorship boards across the country attempted to shut down these films, or at least cut them to pieces. Those same civic groups which enabled prohibition now blamed Hollywood for corrupting society. Movie makers established the Production Code Administration as a form of self-censorship, but it was almost never enforced.
I've taken money out of a lot of funny places, but never anything like this before, honey.
There was a wonderful period that we always think of as pre-code, from 29 to 34, of almost blatant freedom in some of the things that film did and were able to do. Just watching Public Enemy, and, it's obvious that, these two guys are shacking up with these two girls, and it's 1931.
Where do you want to go?
I could think of 1,000 places if you weren't married to Louis.
The studio people who made gangster films, even in the so-called pre-code era where things are pretty loose, realized that these kinds of films were politically dynamite, and that if they weren't reasonably careful about how they made them, they could backfire on them in a big way.
What happened was that directors had to find different ways to get their point across. It actually challenged them to tell their stories more euphemistically.
In Public Enemy, one particular scene where they get their revenge on Putty Nose, and he's playing the piano, and the camera stays on Edward Woods and tracks away from Putty Nose playing the piano and Jimmy Cagney behind him raising the gun.
Lizzie Jones, big and fat, slipped on the ice and broke her.
When Woods gets killed and Cagney goes for retribution, camera stays outside, you hear gunshots, and you hear a man scream. We never see the violence. The violence is all off screen. That, as a younger person watching that, was much more horrific than any of the bloodshed you could have shown.
I ain't so tough.
Everything changed when the code was finally enforced in 1934. Producers now had to follow this new set of rigid rules if they expected their movies to see the inside of a theater.
Every time you put a constriction on a production, what you in fact have to do simply is to adjust a coded language, which the audience shared with the people making the movie. And these guys never had any trouble.
Oh, gee, Pete, it's gonna be wonderful.
You knew what the signs for high passion were. You knew what the signs for extreme violence were, and none of that stuff was actually on the screen.
You tried to be clever in terms of creating a scene. They had to figure out what to cut. How do you not destroy the storyline? So that was, by itself, a work that required genius, in my opinion.
To many, justice was served with the code, banned with the savage brutality, open sexuality, and graphic violence associated with the criminal kind. The code crippled the gangster, and to survive, he would have to adapt.
So what do? You do this. You're going to have these G-men, government men or whatever, detectives or cops, played by the very actors who played the gangsters. And you're going to have them play in the same way. You're going to have them talk fast. You're going to have them being obsessive. You're going to have them being brutish. You're going to have them getting the job done.
Put him under arrest for destroying property.
So you take a look at G-Men with James Cagney, playing an FBI agent who is hot on the trail of these gangsters because they killed his friend. Revenge, obsession.
I'm waiting for this.
What is more, you're going to do the same kind of construction. You're going to have a tight plot full of incidents. You're going to have the montage type of construction. You're going to have everything move fast, talk fast. Tell me, what's the difference between Cagney as a G-Man and Cagney as Tom Powers? Not very much.
Listen to this. Mr. James Davis, Doctor of Law, Doctor of Philosophy, Phi Beta Kappa. Now, isn't that sweet? Phi Beta Kappa.
What's yours, flat-footer copper?
Who said that? Who are you?
I'm Davis. Well, don't let that spoil your fun. Go right ahead.
G-Men is a particularly important film. It's the film that Warner's made basically to buy themselves out of the hole they had got in with the gangster films. It's completely backed by, J. Edgar Hoover. It presents the FBI's side of the war on crime story.
No, he's not as over-the-top violence-loving for violence sake, but he bends the rules as far as the rules will go. But now he's on the right side of the law doing that. And that was a big hit, but you could only take it so far. Audiences really wanted to see him as the bad guy. And so I think one of the ways that filmmakers got around the problem of this glorification thing was if there was a bad guy in the movie, there had to be a badder guy.
Warner Brothers found that badder guy in the experienced but underexposed actor Humphrey Bogart. Bogart's film career had yet to take off, but he was gathering praise on Broadway, starring opposite Leslie Howard in Robert Sherwood's play The Petrified Forest. His desperate, even sympathetic Duke Mantee recalled those rough, rural outlaws that were making their mark in Depression-era headlines. Jack Warner quickly bought the rights to the play.
The ethnic gangster had in a sense, run its course over 3 or 4 years. In the mid-30s, suddenly there was Bonnie and Clyde, there was John Dillinger. There were all these sort of Midwestern bank robbers who were getting all the publicity, and basically the shift to the Anglo-Saxon, Midwestern gangster finds its voice in the movies in Petrified Forest.
Now, when Warner Brothers bought the rights to the play, they wanted Leslie Howard, who was the star there. They did not want Humphrey Bogart. And Leslie Howard said, basically, if you want me for this movie, you have to take Humphrey Bogart. Nobody else can play Duke Mantee but him. So Warner's took him begrudgingly.
Duke Mantee is a character who has the brains to both appreciate and to parry with his intellectual superior, the character played by Leslie Howard. He could just shoot him and be done with it. He's tough enough to shoot him and not give it a second thought, but he doesn't do that. Something about Howard's character intrigues him.
There are so many dead stumps in the desert. That's where I belong. And so do you, Duke. You're the last great apostle of rugged individualism.
Maybe you're right, pal.
Oh, I'm eternally right. But what good does it do me?
I couldn't say.
He sort of gets a degree of amusement from having him around and from being challenged by him, so long as he is in the driver's seat, as long as he retains in his own mind a superior position in that give and take.
Warner didn't know what to do with him because he definitely had very unconventional looks. He was not what anyone would call a handsome leading man in the Errol Flynn vogue. Over the next few years, they put him in some of the strangest roles of his career. I mean, he played a cowboy in The Oklahoma Kid, which also had James Cagney playing a cowboy with a mustache. I mean, talk about two actors who never should have been in a Western in their lives. Those are the ones.
Bogart said that the reason he kept going, even though he wasn't a star in all these early films, is because he had these great death scenes, and audiences never forgot his death scenes, and it's true. He's so mean and so snarling and so sleazy, and part of you just can't wait to see him get it.
Crazy!
And he usually gets it from Cagney or Robinson. They're usually the ones that pull the trigger.
Do me a favor, will you? Don't tell him that a dame tripped me up. Will you? What do I care? You can't live forever.
By the mid-30s, America was losing interest in the gangster. The repeal of Prohibition in 1933 forced the real-life mobsters to find alternate ways to make ends meet, usually in the forms of prostitution, gambling, and labor racketeering. Films like Bullets or Ballots and Racket Busters were tame and predictable. Movie producers who could once read the pulse of the country were struggling to keep up the pace.
Certainly a huge part of why the Warner's movies, the gangster films, still went on even in the late 30s and the 40s was they did know how to adapt the formula. Because, I mean, there's only so many times you can see, a guy getting gunned down or, a battle with the bootleggers. You had to do something different with it. I think one of the best, smartest things Warner's ever did was in the late 1930s when they started doing this group of comedies that showed another side to the gangster.
Remy, take the beer away from that kid.
Yeah, it ain't good for the kids, is it, huh?
It's not that, it'll ruin the piano.
Robinson, because of the nature of the gangster character that he created on screen, this kind of foolish, I want to have class, I want to have culture, the kind of guy. That enabled that character to be dealt with in comedies about gangland. And of course, if you're dealing in a comedy about gangland, then that's not quite as, subject to the criticisms of glorification.
A Slight Case of Murder, I think, is not just one of the best gangster movies, but it's one of the best comedies, I think, that ever came out in the 1930s. In this case, Robinson's character was a bootlegger. Shows, well, what happens to him once, Prohibition is over? What does he do now?
Now look, there'll be lots of people coming up here. They're a cinch to take any one of these kids. Now, I don't want the best. I want the worst. Some little mug that nobody else wants. I want to give him a chance, see? Wow. That's right. Now, give me the ugliest and toughest little gazebo you got. I want to mold them, see?
So they did reinvent the formula that way. And then they also reinvented the character of the gangster as well.
Because you're basically now in these films like A Slight Case of Murder and Brother Orchid and Larceny Incorporated.
I want it wrapped. It's a present. Oh, sure.
You're making them overtly a figure of fun.
Yeah, 975.
And what's interesting about Robinson's character is that the gangland comedies almost enabled him to explore all facets of the character that he had created in a deeper way, a more expansive way than the dramas did.
There must be some mistake.
Yeah, and that's you. If I didn't need you to introduce me to guys out there, I'd put the boots to you. What are you doing in my chair?
Because they were such identifiable types, the caricaturists had a ball. And especially when Warner Brothers' cartoon department started using Hollywood figures in their cartoons, they went to town. They had a wonderful time. Tex Avery made a great cartoon called Thugs with Dirty Mugs, which was a play on Angels with Dirty Faces in 1939.
It was a clean job, see? Nice getaway. But you, Rocky, after this, lay off them penny gum machines. There ain't no money in them, see?
And there are many others that use Cagney and Robinson characters very effectively, just as in the 40s they used Bogart repeatedly.
I said I want rabbit, and I'll give you just 20 minutes to bring it, or else.
Yes, sir, Mr. Bogart. The customer's always white.
By the mid-1930s, Warner Brothers signed Boris Karloff, who, of course, had been a smash in horror films. They wanted to do a horror film, but they made it a gangster horror film. And they made The Walking Dead, in which Karloff played a convicted murderer who goes to the electric chair and then is brought back to life, Frankenstein style, on an operating table with sparkling equipment and so on and so forth.